Welcome to Chapter 27 of Traditions and Encounters, Tradition and Change in East Asia, talking all about China and the other countries around it. China during this time began with the quest for political stability. So after the Mongols left China, the Ming dynasty sort of came back and took control of China once again. The Ming government drove the Mongols out of China, and they had a centralized government control. So even though new invasions from the Mongols occurred, they were centralized and much stronger, so they were able to fend off many of these attacks. They rebuilt and repaired the Great Wall to prevent northern invasions, so this is another continuity over time, sort of hoping to create the Great Wall and keeping it in good shape to secure its borders. And they also restored Chinese traditions, such as cultural traditions that the Mongols had sort of driven out of China, and also the civil service examinations to find qualified bureaucrats for their government. Eventually, though, the Ming Empire declined because coastal cities and trade was disrupted by pirates. They also declined because of government corruption and inefficiency caused by powerful eunuchs. So these were basically people who were government officials, and they subverted the control of the emperor. Also, famines and peasant rebellions occurred near the end of the Ming because, of course, there wasn't enough food. And a final thing was that Manchu invaders, eventually with the peasants' support, led to the final Ming collapse and the start of a new empire. This new empire became known as the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty, unlike the Ming, wasn't really Chinese. It was more of Manchus. So Manchus were invaders from Manchuria to the northeast. This is around sort of present-day northern Korea-ish. And they overwhelmed the Chinese forces and proclaimed the Qing dynasty, so effectively ending the Ming dynasty. Originally, these Manchus were pastoral nomads, but they organized a powerful military and started to take over many parts of East Asia. They captured Korea and Mongolia, so the old home of the Mongols, and then China. And they remain an ethnic elite. This ethnic elite of Manchus forbade intermarriage with Chinese, kind of like what the Mongols did, because, of course, to them, the Chinese were just outside people. During this time, there was one effective emperor. His name was Kangxi, and he was a Confucian scholar, actually. He was effective and an enlightened ruler. He also helped the Qing dynasty conquer other territories, such as Taiwan, Mongolia, Central Asia, and Tibet. Also, for the Manchus, there was the concept of the son of heaven and the scholar bureaucrats. The emperor was considered the son of heaven, so divine right once again. Basically, to the Manchus, heavenly powers and an obligation to maintain order on earth was the whole reason they were trying to invade China and sort of take control. And these people lived a privileged life with great authority and great power as well. During this time, the governance of the empire fell to civil servants, so even though Manchus came in, they still preserved some of the old-time customs of Chinese government, such as the civil service, and also scholar bureaucrats, so educated people were taken to serve in government. These people still learned Confucian texts and calligraphy, so at least they still maintained some Chinese customs, but they also had to pass rigorous examinations with strict quotas in order to qualify. The examination system was huge in Chinese society, and this exam was really competitive, and usually people with the best merit would be chosen to serve in this government. Wealthy families generally had the advantage because they had money to get tutors and stuff, kind of like today, but poor families could still make it if their child was super brilliant, and this curriculum fostered common values that were beneficial to all of Chinese society. Chinese throughout history as a continuity was a patriarchal system. This was a basic unit of Chinese society, and the highest value was placed on filial piety, which was sort of the respect for the oldest male in the family. And this included the duties of children to their fathers and the loyalty of subjects to the emperor, who of course was male. These important functions of clan really set the stage for Chinese social hierarchy and affected how everything worked in China. Gender relations, of course, still strict patriarchal control over all females. Parents continue to prefer boys over girls because, of course, marriage is continued through the male line. Female infanticide was really high because females were not really preferred, and widows were encouraged to commit suicide many of the time if their husband died, unfortunately. Foot binding during this time also increased. This especially happened to young girls, primarily in the Qing dynasty. In China, it was kind of like a status symbol for wealthy girls and women to bind their feet together, and over time, eventually when they became an adult, their feet would become really small. I don't know why that is, but it was a really bad habit and tradition in China, and eventually many women had feet so badly deformed as a result of foot binding that they couldn't walk when they grew up. So this was a bad cultural tradition of the time. Also, there was the lowest status person in a family was usually a young bride. So if you were a young girl, your future didn't seem so bright. Population growth and economic development occurred as well. Garden-style agriculture, of course, in fertile China fed a large population. As a result of the Columbian Exchange, the American food crops came over as well, so corn, sweet potatoes, peanuts. These all helped improve nutrition in China as well, and land availability also became more prevalent and productivity increased. So when there's more agricultural foodstuffs, population of course grew, as was evident in China. Manufacturing and trade also benefited from the abundant cheap labor, so China had a big population. They exported large quantities of trade goods such as silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and tea. They were usually compensated for the exports by importing silver bullion. So all this new silver from mines such as Potosi over in South America came over, and China became really stacked with a bunch of silver. Foreign trade also brought wealth to the dynasty, but it also threatened the scholar bureaucrats who were kind of seen as the top people in China at the time. But eventually, some emperors such as Kangxi began a policy of strict control on this foreign contract. Western merchants still existed though, and they were restricted to cities such as Macau and Guangzhou, which are still major trade cities over in China today. Macau is kind of like the Las Vegas of the East. There's a lot of casinos there. Government and technology was big too. Technological change was considered disruptive by these two new dynasties, so they didn't really promote it, which of course scaled back China's innovation. Not really good for a civilization that was known for inventing many things. And with lots of labor-saving technologies were seen as unnecessary because people could just do it. Privileged classes existed as well, so scholar bureaucrats and the gentry, of course, were the highest in government, and they directed the local governments and society. Peasants, the largest class, were also kind of low though, but they were esteemed by Confucianism because they were honest, hardworking people. Artisans and other skilled workers were sometimes in between. They had decent economic status, and merchants were also pretty powerful and wealthy because they really gave the wealth of China to China. Lower classes or mean people, they really didn't have much, just like in many other societies. Another social aspect of the time was the queue. This was the stereotypical braid that men wore as a result of the Manchus making them wear it. So if you ever see those pictures of a Chinese man wearing a braid, that's generally attributed to these Manchus and the Qing dynasty. It was actually because the Qing dynasty mandated that all males wear it, and as a result, that kind of became another social custom of the time, although it was not originally Chinese. New traditions and new cultural influences came as well. One thing was Neo-Confucianism, which was a syncretic religion between regular Confucianism and some Buddhism and Taoism as well. The Confucian education was supported, of course, by the Ming and Qing emperors who used it to select their government bureaucrats. Also during this time, there were imperial cultural projects such as encyclopedias and libraries. These were really just intended to sort of promote China's history and better literacy across China as well. Popular culture also included novels and romances, and many of the best Chinese works during this time were also written during these two dynasties. Christianity made a return to China as well, so the Italian Jesuits came to the Ming court, and these people really started to try to blend with the Chinese and try to convert them to Christianity as well, although it didn't always work. Confucianism and Christianity were kind of like The Jesuits respected the Chinese traditions, and as a result, they didn't really win many converts. And the Chinese had problems with the exclusivity of Christianity, so it wasn't really syncretic at this time, like, say, Confucianism. So that's why not many Chinese converted to Christianity as well. And the Jesuits, even though they weren't able to really convert many Chinese, they were an important bridge between Chinese and Western cultures, kind of like Marco Polo was. It introduced each other to the achievements of each other and sort of connected the West and the East. So with that, that's basically China. We'll just review the famous Chinese dynasties real quick because legit, they always appear on the AP exam. So Chinese dynasties in order began with the Xia, the Qing, the Zhou dynasty, followed by the Qin Han, then the Sui, Tang, Song, and that was followed by the Yuan dynasty, which was really the Mongols. Finally, in this chapter, we learn about the Ming and Qing, who were the Manchurians. That's basically all the ancient Chinese dynasties in world history, a pretty complete list. Finally, we move to Japanish. Japan is also, of course, in East Asia because it's east of China. Japan during this time was able to unify itself and be centralized, even though before in history it wasn't really unified. It was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, which was kind of like a dynasty, but in Japanese terms. Tokugawa Ieyasu brought stability to Japan after 1600, and Japan instead was divided into warring feudal estates. So kind of like in Western Europe, where big lands were ruled by certain lords, and together they were centralized by the government. Also, Ieyasu was the shogun. The shogun was the powerful military leader at the time, and as a result, he established a military government to sort of control and regulate Japan. First, they needed to control the daimyo, though, which were the powerful local lords who sort of owned these feudal estates, and each daimyo had basically absolute rule, so the Tokugawa shoguns wanted to take these people under control so they could have more power as well. As a result, they required these daimyo to live alternate years at Edo, which was the capital of Japan at the time. So, for example, if this was today, maybe a rich person would have to live in Washington, D.C. for a few times, just so the government could have better control of them. There's also a control of foreign relations, so the shoguns adopted a policy of strict isolationism from the outside world. They didn't really want to trade much, not even with China. And foreign trade was under tight restriction at the port of Nagasaki and other ports. And despite this policy, Japan was never really completely isolated because merchants still decided to come despite the government not wanting them. Population grow as well, but eventually it slowed down due to infanticide, contraception, late marriage, and abortions. This is kind of limiting the population of Japan. Social change occurred as well. Peace undermined the social and economic roles of the warrior elites, and merchants became really prominent, and sometimes they were even wealthier than the ruling elites just because from so many different foreign places they were able to extract money. Neo-Confucianism came over to Japan from China as well. It was all about loyalty and submission, and it eventually even became the official ideology of the Tokugawas. The scholars in Japan decided to adopt native learning, which was trying to establish a distinctive Japanese identity. So Japan was first really settled by what historians think were people who were trying to find an elixium for the Qin Emperor in early China, and they knew that if they didn't find this and they returned to China, they would be executed for failing to find basically a drug that would let the emperor live forever. As a result, they just stayed in Japan where they last were searching for this drug, and they kind of just lived there and developed from there. As a result, Japan adopted many things from China, including language that is still evident today. And as a result, that's really why Japan had a sort of similar identity to China. Both native learning, they wanted a more distinctive identity. Floating worlds happened as well, so urban cities went up, and a special note of culture was the kabuki theaters, which were kind of like puppet theaters at the time. Christians and Dutch came in as well, kind of like they went into China. These Christian missionaries, which were Jesuits, had lots of success in converting, so it's better than in China. But an anti-Christian campaign was eventually launched by the Tokugawa shoguns, and as a result, eventually they got kicked out. Buddhists and Confucians, of course, didn't really like Christianity, and eventually these Christians were all kicked out. The Dutch, though, they were still able to trade in Japan, so that isolationism didn't really take place. These scholars were really able to interact with the Dutch and have more Western learning as well. Eventually, European art, medicine, and science began to influence these Japanese scholars as well. And basically, as you can see, from East Asia, Western European contributed a lot to their development during this time period as well. So in conclusion, this has been Chapter 27, Traditions and Change in East Asia. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.